In the scorching heat of August 480 BC, along the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae, the fate of Western civilization hung by a thread. Here, where the mountains kissed the sea and sulfur springs bubbled from the earth, a small band of Greek warriors prepared to face the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever witnessed. This was not merely a clash of armies, this was the collision of two worlds, the final stand of free men against the unstoppable tide of empire. The Persian host, stretching beyond the horizon, was a sight that defied comprehension. Banners from 100 nations fluttered in the Mediterranean breeze as the greatest military machine ever assembled descended upon Greece like a plague of locusts. At its head rode Xerxes, king of kings, ruler of an empire that stretched from the burning sands of Egypt to the frozen steppes of Central Asia. His army was so vast that ancient chroniclers claimed it drank rivers dry and darkened the sky with arrows. Yet standing in their path, positioned at the narrowest point where ancient Greece could still draw breath, stood just 300 Spartan warriors. Led by their king, Leonidas, these bronze-clad guardians of freedom had marched north, knowing they would never return home. They were not here to win. They were here to buy time with their blood, to show the world that even the mightiest empire could bleed when it faced men who refused to kneel. This is the story of Thermopylae, where impossibility became legend, where the few stood against the many, and where 3 days of unimaginable courage changed the course of human history forever. The road to this inevitable confrontation had been paved with Persian ambition and Greek defiance for over a decade. It began in 490 BC, when Darius the Great, Xerxes' father, had sent his armies across the Aegean to punish Athens for supporting rebellious Greek cities in Asia Minor. That expedition ended in humiliation on the beaches of Marathon, where Athenian hoplites shattered Persian lines and sent the survivors fleeing back across the sea. For Darius, Marathon was more than a military defeat. It was a wound to imperial pride that festered in the halls of Persepolis. The great king swore vengeance against the Greeks, but death claimed him before he could fulfill his oath. That burden passed to his son Xerxes, a man whose appetite for glory matched his empire's boundless ambition. Unlike his father's hasty expedition, Xerxes would leave nothing to chance. For 3 years, from 484 to 481 BC, the Persian Empire mobilized for the greatest military campaign in human history. Tribute flowed from every corner of the known world. Ships were built, supplies gathered, and roads carved through mountains to accommodate the endless columns of soldiers that would march west. The army that assembled at Sardis defied imagination. Modern historians estimate that between 100,000 and 150,000 fighting men answered Xerxes' call to arms, though ancient sources inflated this number to impossible millions. Persian Immortals in scale armor marched alongside Median cavalry, Assyrian archers, and Egyptian marines. Scythian horsemen from the steppes rode beside Indian war elephants, while Phoenician sailors crewed the 1,000 ships that would shadow the army's advance. This was not merely a military force. It was the empire itself on the march, a living demonstration of Persian power that was meant to break the will of any who dared resist. Cities that submitted were spared and rewarded. Those that defied the King of Kings were wiped from the earth as examples to others. Meanwhile, in the fractured landscape of Greece, panic spread faster than wildfire. For centuries, the Greek city-states had fought each other as much as any foreign enemy. Unity was a foreign concept in a land where every valley seemed to harbor a different people with their own gods, customs, and ambitions. Yet the shadow of Persian domination forced even the most bitter rivals to consider the unthinkable: cooperation. In 481 BC, representatives from across Greece gathered at the Isthmus of Corinth to form what history would remember as the Hellenic League. It was a fragile alliance born of desperation rather than trust, uniting Athens and Sparta despite their fundamental differences. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, brought naval expertise and innovative thinking. Sparta contributed military tradition and the finest heavy infantry in the Greek world. The strategic challenge facing the Greeks was daunting. How could a collection of small city-states hope to stand against the assembled might of the Persian Empire? The answer lay not in matching Persian numbers, but in using Greece's mountainous terrain to neutralize Persian advantages. If the Greeks could force the massive Persian army into narrow passes where numbers meant nothing, they might have a chance. Thermopylae, the hot gates, emerged as the perfect defensive position. Here, where the Kalidromos Mountains plunged directly into the Malian Gulf, nature had carved a passage barely wide enough for a cart. Any army marching south would be forced to squeeze through this bottleneck, where even a small force could hold back a multitude. The pass itself was a study in contrasts. To the west, steep cliffs rose like castle walls, impassable to any army. To the east, the sea stretched to the horizon, its waters too rough for ships to land troops behind the Greek position. In between lay a strip of ground so narrow that a few dozen men could block it entirely. It was here that Leonidas would make his stand, not because he believed he could stop the Persian army, but because he understood that some causes were worth dying for. The Spartan king knew that his sacrifice would inspire all of Greece, that his death would be more powerful than any victory he could hope to achieve. The selection of Leonidas for this impossible mission was no accident. At 60 years of age, the Spartan king embodied everything his warrior society valued. He had been shaped by the agoge, the brutal training system that forged Spartan boys into living weapons from the age of 7. He had proven himself in battle and leadership, ruling Sparta for a decade with the respect of his peers and the loyalty of his subjects. More importantly, Leonidas understood the true nature of his mission. This was not about holding a pass indefinitely or achieving a conventional military victory. This was about demonstrating to the world that free men would rather die than submit to tyranny. It was about buying time for the rest of Greece to prepare its defenses and for the combined Greek fleet to position itself for the naval battles that would ultimately decide the war. The 300 Spartans who marched north with their king were not chosen at random. Each was a seasoned warrior in the prime of life, selected not only for his skill with sword and spear, but for having living sons who could carry on their bloodlines. These men understood they were marching to their deaths, yet they went forward with the calm determination that was the hallmark of Spartan training. They were joined by allies who shared their resolve. 700 Thespians volunteered to stand with the Spartans, knowing full well the fate that awaited them. 400 Thebans were compelled to join, their loyalty uncertain but their presence necessary to maintain the fragile Greek coalition. Together, this small force of roughly 7,000 men would face the greatest army the world had ever seen. As the Greek force took position at Thermopylae, they began preparations for a siege that would test every aspect of their training and courage. They reinforced the ancient Phocian Wall that blocked the pass, turning it into a fortress of stone and bronze. Behind this barrier, they would make their stand, their shields locked together, their spears thrust forward like the quills of some great bronze hedgehog. The psychological impact of their decision rippled across Greece like a stone thrown into still water. Here was proof that the Persian giant could be challenged, that free men possessed a strength that no amount of gold or terror could purchase. The very audacity of standing against such overwhelming odds became a source of inspiration that would outlast the men who made that choice. As summer waned in 480 BC, two forces that would reshape the ancient world drew inexorably toward their fateful meeting. From the north came the thunder of Persian boots, a rhythm that had echoed across continents as Xerxes' host advanced through Thrace and Macedonia. Cities opened their gates without resistance, their leaders calculating that submission was preferable to annihilation. The Persian war machine rolled forward with mechanical precision, its supply trains stretching back to Asia Minor, its advanced scouts already probing the mountain passes that led into the heart of Greece. From the south came a different kind of thunder, the measured step of men who had accepted their doom. The Spartan column moved through the Greek countryside like a blade drawn from its sheath, polished and deadly. Leonidas rode at their head, his bronze armor catching the morning sun, his red cloak flowing behind him like a banner of defiance. The sight of their king leading them to certain death filled his warriors with a fierce pride that burned brighter than fear. The march north was both funeral procession and celebration. In every village they passed, crowds gathered to witness the Spartans' passage. Children threw flowers, women wept, and old men who had fought in wars long past straightened their shoulders and remembered what it meant to be Greek. These warriors carried with them not just weapons and armor, but the hopes of a free people who refused to bow before any king, no matter how great his power. Word of their advance reached Xerxes as his vast army crossed from Asia into Europe. The Persian king received the news with a mixture of amusement and irritation. That such a small force would dare to oppose him seemed almost insulting, like a mouse challenging a lion. Yet something in the reports troubled him. These were not desperate refugees fleeing before his advance, but professional soldiers marching deliberately toward a confrontation they could not possibly win. The cultural gulf between the two forces was as vast as their numerical disparity. The Persians fought for conquest, for the glory of their king, and for the wealth that victory would bring. They were professional soldiers drawn from across the known world, united by discipline and the promise of reward. Their strength lay in their diversity, their ability to adapt different fighting styles to different situations. The Greeks fought for something far more precious and far more dangerous, the right to live as free men. Every Spartan in Leonidas's force had been raised from childhood to believe that death was preferable to dishonor, that retreat was unthinkable, and that their individual lives mattered less than the survival of their way of life. This was not merely military training, but cultural programming that ran deeper than bone and blood. As the Persian advance guard finally came within sight of Thermopylae, Xerxes ordered his army to halt. The pass lay before them, seemingly empty except for the ancient wall that blocked the narrowest point. Behind that wall, the great king's spies reported, waited a force so small it could barely fill a city square. Yet something made Xerxes pause, some instinct honed by years of conquest that whispered of hidden dangers. The delay gave both sides time to study their opponents. Persian scouts examined the Greek position from every angle, searching for weaknesses in defenses that seemed almost insultingly simple. The wall was old and weathered, hastily reinforced with stones and timber. Behind it, they could see the bronze gleam of armor and the steady movement of men who showed no sign of panic or preparation for retreat. What the Persians could not understand was the psychological fortress that Leonidas had constructed behind that physical wall. Every man in the Greek force understood his role in the coming drama. They were not here to survive, but to make their deaths count for something greater than themselves. This knowledge freed them from the fear that paralyzed ordinary soldiers, replacing it with a cold clarity that made them infinitely more dangerous. The first Persian emissaries arrived under flags of truce, bearing offers that would have tempted any rational commander. Xerxes promised wealth beyond imagination, positions of honor in his empire, and the chance to rule over their fellow Greeks as Persian satraps. All they had to do was lay down their weapons and submit to the inevitable. The response they received would echo through history. The Spartans had come not to negotiate, but to fight. Leonidas himself received the final embassy, a magnificently dressed Persian noble who spoke perfect Greek and carried gifts fit for kings. The terms were simple and generous. Surrender now and live in luxury, or face annihilation when the full weight of Persian power fell upon them. The Spartan king's response was equally simple. He had not marched 300 miles to hand over his weapons to a foreign tyrant. That evening, as both armies prepared for the battle that would begin at dawn, the contrast between the two camps could not have been more stark. In the Persian lines, tens of thousands of cooking fires stretched to the horizon, their smoke rising like incense to the gods of war. The sound of different languages mingled with the clatter of armor and weapons as soldiers from across the empire made ready for what they assumed would be a brief and one-sided slaughter. Behind the Greek wall, the scene was almost intimate by comparison. 300 Spartans sat in small groups, their weapons laid out with ceremonial precision. They spoke little. These men who had known each other since childhood, who had trained together and fought together, and now would die together. Some cleaned their bronze armor until it gleamed like mirrors. Others combed their long hair with the careful attention to appearance that marked them as warriors preparing for their final battle. The allied contingents watched the Spartans with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. The Thespians, volunteers who had chosen to share this fate, showed similar composure. The Thebans, present more from political necessity than enthusiasm, seemed less certain of their commitment. Yet all understood that tomorrow would separate the living from the dead, and that their names would either be remembered with honor or forgotten in the dust of defeat. As darkness fell over Thermopylae, Leonidas walked among his men, offering words of encouragement that carried the weight of prophecy. He reminded them that they fought not for conquest or glory, but for the right of their children to grow up as free Greeks rather than Persian slaves. He spoke of the warriors who had fallen at Marathon and of the greater battles that would follow their sacrifice. Most importantly, he assured them that their deaths would not be meaningless, that every Persian they killed here would be one fewer to threaten the cities and families they had left behind. The final hours before battle passed with ritualistic solemnity. Priests moved among the Greek lines, offering prayers and libations to the gods who watched over warriors. The Spartans performed the ancient ceremonies that prepared them for death, anointing their bodies and dedicating their weapons to the divine powers that governed the fate of mortals. They knew that by the time the sun set again, most of them would be dining in the halls of the heroic dead. As dawn broke over the narrow pass, the morning mist rose from the sulfur springs like spirits departing the battlefield before the carnage began. The silence that had settled over both camps during the dark hours shattered with the blast of Persian war horns, their haunting notes echoing off the mountain walls like the voices of ancient gods calling mortals to judgment. Xerxes had positioned his golden throne upon a hill overlooking the pass, a vantage point that would allow him to witness the destruction of the insolent Greeks who dared defy his will. Draped in purple silk and surrounded by his personal guard, the King of Kings expected to watch a brief demonstration of Persian superiority, followed by the ritual execution of prisoners who had foolishly chosen resistance over submission. The first wave of attackers was not the cream of the Persian military. Xerxes sent forward the Medes and Cissians, capable fighters but not the elite troops that formed the backbone of his empire. This was both tactical calculation and imperial arrogance. The great king wanted to save his finest warriors for worthier opponents, assuming that provincial troops would suffice to sweep aside what appeared to be little more than an armed mob blocking his path. The Persian assault began with a rain of arrows that darkened the morning sky. Thousands of bowmen had positioned themselves within range of the Greek wall, their composite bows singing in harmony as they unleashed volley after volley toward the bronze shields that glittered behind the stone barrier. The sound was like hail on rooftops, a metallic drumbeat that should have driven any sane defenders to seek shelter. Yet the Spartans did not flinch. Their shields, forged from layers of bronze and wood, caught the Persian shafts like nets catching fish. Those arrows that found gaps in the shield wall struck armor that had been crafted by the finest smiths in Greece. Bronze plates fitted so perfectly that they turned aside points that would have skewered lesser men. Behind their wall of metal and wood, the Greek warriors waited with the patience of hunters who knew their prey was coming to them. When the arrow storm finally ceased, the Median infantry charged forward with wild cries that had struck terror into enemies from the Ganges to the Nile. They came in loose formation, armed with wicker shields and short spears, confident that their numbers would overwhelm any resistance. These were the troops who had conquered Babylon and crushed rebellions across the empire's vast expanse. They expected to find Greeks cowering behind their pathetic wall, ready to surrender or die like sheep before wolves. Instead, they found bronze-clad death waiting for them. The moment the Persians reached the reconstructed wall, they discovered that their greatest advantage had become their fatal weakness. The narrow pass that had forced Xerxes to attack on a front barely 50 meters wide meant that only a few dozen of his soldiers could engage the Greeks at any given moment. The vast army stretching back to the horizon was reduced to the strength of its leading edge, while every Greek warrior could participate in the defense. The Spartan phalanx operated like a perfectly calibrated killing machine. Each warrior's shield protected not only himself, but also the man to his right, creating an unbroken wall of bronze that no individual heroics could penetrate. From behind this barrier, their dory spears thrust forward in deadly rhythm, each point seeking the gaps in Persian armor or the exposed flesh beneath hastily raised shields. The Medes who reached the wall found themselves trapped in a nightmare of bronze and iron. They could not retreat because their own comrades pressed forward from behind, driven by officers who had not yet realized the futility of the assault. They could not advance because the Spartan spears kept them at a distance where their shorter weapons were useless. They could only die, impaled on Greek points or crushed beneath the press of their own retreating forces. Xerxes watched from his throne as his first assault dissolved into chaos. Warriors who had never known defeat found themselves broken against a defense that seemed to mock the very concept of numerical superiority. The narrow ground that should have been the Greeks' weakness had become their strength, transforming a handful of defenders into an immovable obstacle that his vast army could not simply overwhelm through weight of numbers. The sight of Median bodies piling up before the Greek wall sent murmurs of unease through the Persian ranks. These were seasoned soldiers who had witnessed the destruction of cities and the collapse of kingdoms, yet they had never seen anything like the methodical slaughter taking place at Thermopylae. The Greeks fought with a precision that bordered on the supernatural, as if they were components of some great bronze engine designed for nothing but killing. As the morning wore on, wave after wave of Persian attackers broke themselves against the Spartan line. Each assault began with the same confidence and ended with the same result: broken weapons, scattered shields, and the screams of wounded men being pulled back from the killing ground. The narrow pass became a charnel house where Persian blood soaked into Greek soil, feeding the earth that had given birth to the warriors who now defended it with their lives. The psychological impact of this carnage rippled through the Persian host, like cracks spreading through marble. These soldiers had followed Xerxes because they believed in his invincibility, because they had been taught that Persian arms were blessed by the gods and destined to rule the world. Now they watched that certainty crumble as their comrades died in droves against an enemy that refused to break or bend or show any sign of human weakness. Leonidas moved among his warriors like a bronze-clad deity, his voice carrying words of encouragement that rang louder than the clash of weapons. He fought in the front rank when needed, his spear finding Persian hearts with the skill of a man who had trained for this moment his entire life. Yet his greatest contribution was not his personal prowess, but his ability to maintain the discipline that kept the phalanx intact under the most desperate circumstances. The Spartan king understood that this battle was as much about morale as tactics. Every Persian who fell sent a message that echoed far beyond Thermopylae. The mighty could be brought low, the inevitable could be defied, and free men possessed a strength that no empire could purchase or command. His warriors were not just defending a mountain pass, but demonstrating to the world that courage could triumph over overwhelming odds. By midday, the ground before the Greek wall was carpeted with Persian dead. The narrow space had become so choked with bodies that fresh attackers had to climb over their fallen comrades to reach the Spartan spears. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the sulfur smell of the hot springs, creating an atmosphere that seemed drawn from the depths of Hades itself. Yet still the attacks continued, driven by Persian pride and the terrible momentum of imperial ambition. Xerxes had committed too much to this invasion to accept defeat from such a small force. His reputation, his empire, and his very identity as the chosen of the gods depended on crushing these insolent Greeks who dared to stand in his path. Each failed assault only increased his determination to see the pass cleared and his enemies destroyed. The afternoon brought new tactics as Persian commanders sought ways to break the deadlock that was bleeding their army white. They tried coordinated attacks from multiple directions, only to find that the narrow ground prevented proper coordination. They attempted to overwhelm the Greeks with sheer numbers, launching massive assaults that succeeded only in creating larger piles of corpses. Nothing they tried could crack the bronze shell of the Spartan defense. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, both sides paused to assess the day's carnage. The Persians had lost thousands of men in exchange for exactly nothing. The pass remained blocked, the Greeks remained defiant, and the mighty army of Xerxes had been stopped cold by a force that could have fit comfortably inside a small temple. The flames of the funeral pyres would burn for days after the last Spartan fell, their smoke rising toward the heavens like prayers for the heroic dead. Thermopylae had ended as Leonidas knew it must, with Persian victory and Greek annihilation. Yet in their defeat, the 300 had achieved something far greater than survival. They had shattered the myth of Persian invincibility and lit a fire of resistance that would consume an empire. The narrow pass where they made their final stand became sacred ground, a testament to the truth that some things are worth more than life itself. Their sacrifice would echo through the ages, proving that when free men stand together against tyranny, even death becomes victory.